Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode we're doing a top 10. Topic of this top 10, Masters of Disguise. This comes to us as a recommendation from our good friend the American Samurai Bucky749. Also shout out to your brother Jeremy, the Iceman. There's going to be a callback to Jeremy in this. Shout out to you, Iceman. And basically what we're going to count here is either wrestlers that for whatever reason had to use a disguise, whether it be a one-off to surprise an opponent, they were suspended so they had to use a mask for a couple months while they were suspended, or in a couple cases, wrestlers that had multiple gimmicks in the same company at the same time and would use those different gimmicks to wrestle in different styles. With that being said, let's jump right into it. Number 10, again, shout out to the Iceman. Dean Malenko dressing up as Cyclope to win a Cruiserweight Battle Royal at Slamboree 98 and then go into a championship match for the Cruiserweight Championship against Chris Jericho. What can I say about Dean Malenko that hasn't been said a million times? He is a great wrestler, one of the underrated talents of all time, one of the guys that you look at and you see that he could have been much more than what was given to him. This was extremely fun. You had Jericho to play off of. Malenko took it a couple months off because he had lost a few matches to Jericho, and he questioned his abilities. He questioned if he should continue to wrestle. The fact that he came back and he surprised the fans in attendance and surprised everybody watching, surprised Chris Jericho, made this an awesome segment on what was a pretty good pay-per-view, Slamboree 98, and hopefully I'm not remembering that wrong and confusing it with a different Slamboree. But I thought it was a good pay-per-view. I thought this was a great match. Two great matches back-to-back. A great way to bring Dean Malenko back into the fold. I absolutely love this disguise. Going from that, our number 9. The Boogie Woogie Man, Jimmy Valiant, as Charlie Brown from Out of Town. There are a few times in Boogie's career that he would lose a loser leaves town match or a loser leaves the company match. And surprisingly, this guy with a mask that is very obvious as Jimmy Valiant. I mean, he doesn't hide his tattoos. He has his beard coming out of the mask. Charlie Brown from Out of Town starts appearing, thus frustrating the heels, as most of the times with this gimmick being used would take place. This gimmick that Charlie Brown from Out of Town would lead us into one of Jimmy Valiant's most enduring and probably most memorable feuds against Paul Jones's Army. While during his time as Charlie Brown, he got his beard cut by the Army and then would go on a several-year feud with different members of the faction. I just love this, and I love the fact that the announcers played it up as he could be anybody else when the fans all knew exactly who he was. I thought this was really fun, an awesome way for one of the most charismatic talents of all time to show even more charisma. Now going from that, our number 8, Bullet Bob Armstrong as the Bullet. This is where he picked up the Bullet nickname. In the early 70s, Bob Armstrong had a weightlifting accident where weight bench broke and the weights dropped on his face, thus causing him to have some facial reconstruction surgery. His face never really looked the same after, and he was self-conscious about that, or at least this is the way the story goes. So he would wrestle under a mask as the Bullet. Eventually, what was a small-time use, something to get the fans back to seeing Bullet Bob Armstrong, eventually morphed over his career to him using the Bullet mask on and off, regularly interchanging whether he'd wear the mask or not wear the mask. A trait that we'd see in a couple of our later incidences where there was a little bit of a style shift when he would become the Bullet and have the mask on from when he was just Bob Armstrong. The Bullet was a little bit more vicious than just Bob Armstrong was. I loved every part of that. He's one of the great talents in the history of that Georgia Championship Wrestling era, Continental Wrestling, the Memphis Wrestling, basically every Southern promotion Bob Armstrong laid his fingers on and made an instant impact, a lasting impact. He's one of the wrestlers that the kids growing up and adults even at that time watching remember fondly. He's always going to be one of their favorites. I thoroughly enjoyed it, hence why it makes my list. Next up, number 7, The Machines. The Machines were used as a way to bring Andre the Giant back. Andre got suspended so he could get back surgery and shoot the Princess Bride movie. He was brought back and they were going to make him part of a tag team to kind of take a little bit of the pressure of him having to wrestle off. So he was brought back as a team called the Machines, a masked team. He was the Giant Machine. The masked superstar was the Super Machine. And eventually they brought in Blackjack Mulligan when Andre was worse off than they even thought, to be the Big Machine. There'd be other wrestlers that would wrestle with Machines masks that were super obvious who they were. The Hawk Machine, the Piper Machine. I believe even one time the Crusher was the Crusher Machine when they were in Minneapolis. This was during a time where he was feuding with Bobby Heenan and Heenan's forces, the Heenan family. Heenan would rant and rave that it was obvious it was Andre the Giant. Gorilla Monsoon would argue it could be Giant Bob or a different giant that we haven't heard of yet. Ultimately, the gimmick ends when Andre returns as himself, gets reinstated. We find out later on that the reason that Andre was reinstated to end this gimmick, he had turned heel and joined Heenan. Thus, Heenan dropped his argument. Heenan requested Andre be reinstated. That led to the legendary WrestleMania 3 match. It was short-lived, and for someone who was a really young wrestling fan at the time, I loved the Machines gimmick. It's something that's stuck in my head ever since that time frame. Probably my fondest memories of Andre the Giant were of this time of the Giant Machine era, his feud with Big John Studd. After this, he would kind of deteriorate rather rapidly, but this was like the last stand of one of the great wrestlers of all time. I absolutely loved the gimmick. I thought it was amazing. Going from that, our number 6. One of the times it was just a one-time use. On an episode of Monday Nitro, Randy Macho Man Savage is wrestling against La Parka. La Parka gets a surprising win over the Macho Man and unmasks to be Diamond Dallas Page. This was absolutely awesome because when you look back at WCW, and specifically the WCW era, take away the Jim Crockett era, one of the feuds that everybody goes back to and talks about with such reverence and such fondness is the DDP and Savage feud. These guys absolutely went out there. Savage wanted to prove that he was still a big star. DDP wanted to prove that he was a big star on the level of Randy Savage. They had an amazing feud. This was just another memorable moment in that feud. Again, much like I said with the Machines, for anybody that was watching WCW Nitro at that time or flipping back and forth and caught this was a holy crap kind of moment. You couldn't believe that just happened. It was an amazing moment and an amazing part of a fantastic feud, hence why it's on my list. Going from that, our number 5, Finn Balor and the Demon. This would probably rank a little bit higher for me if there was more of a difference between Finn Balor worked and how he worked as a Demon. I always wanted him to ramp up the aggression, much like I said with Bob Armstrong, when he used the Demon persona. I thought that was one of the reasons why you would bust that out. They played it up to that. They played it up to the Demon being a more dangerous version of Finn Balor. But he really didn't change his style that much, other than adding the awesome entrances and the awesome paint jobs. He basically wrestled the same way that he did the match before. Even with that, the Demon era of Finn Balor to me is one of the iconic runs in NXT, one of the reasons why NXT was must-watch television for a very long time. He was one of the very highlights of that show. I mean, the guy is absolutely an amazing wrestler, an amazing talent. I know it's been a while now, and he's kind of a heel at the time of this recording on television, but I guarantee you the next time the Demon character gets busted out, whether it be when the Judgment Day breaks up and he has to fight either Damian Priest or Dominic Mysterio and he has to call on the Demon to win that battle, I guarantee the fans are going to lose it over it. They're going to go insane. He's going to get the loudest pop he probably ever had in his career if he ever decides to bring that Demon character back. It's so beloved, and I know this is not something that really should be considered, but it sold so much merchandise. Kids loved it, adults loved it, everybody watching loved that gimmick. Again, I have a little bit of a criticism of it, but I can't deny the success of it. Now going from that, our number 4. This one's a twofer. Junkyard Dog and Coco Beware, both adopting the Stagger Lee gimmick. Now, I've never heard it said that one or the other borrowed the gimmick from each other. They both happened right around the same time frame in 1982, and it was very close that you could say they may have individually thought of this, or a shared booker may have gave it to both of them. Both lost Loser Leaves Town matches and came back Junkyard Dog as Stagger Lee, Koko B. Ware as Stagger Lee, Koko going up against his former partner Bobby Eaton at the time. Junkyard Dog was in a feud with Ted DiBiase at the time. Again, much like I said with the Machines, with Heenan arguing the Machines were the Andre the Giant. The faces in these cases, Jimmy Hart, Ted DiBiase, both were arguing that Koko and Junkyard Dog, in different companies and different promotions, mind you, were both Stagger Lee. JYD would lose the Stagger Lee gimmick once his suspension or his Loser Leaves Town stipulation had ran its course. Koko would drop it during a match where he was teamed with Norvell Austin, basically unmasking and becoming a heel again. Him and Norvell would form the PYT Express. Both were iconic runs at this time. Both are looked back fondly by fans of CWA and Mid-South Wrestling. Two absolute legends of 80s wrestling, Junkyard Dog and Koko B. Ware, both using that Stagger Lee gimmick. Now going from that, our number 3, Dusty Rhodes as the Midnight Rider. Throughout his career, Dusty would use the Midnight Rider gimmick, whether it be in Florida or Jim Crockett Promotions. He used it multiple times, where he would lose a Loser Leaves Town match for a certain amount of time. All of a sudden, this guy with a black and silver mask, calling himself the Midnight Rider, would show up and wrestle just like Dusty Rhodes again, much like I said with the aforementioned Stagger Lee and Machines gimmicks. All the heels would argue that it was Dusty. There was even a point where Dusty Rhodes beat Ric Flair as the Midnight Rider, but due to the NWA rules at the time, if he didn't unmask, he couldn't keep the championship. He didn't have to unmask in front of the crowd. He just had to unmask in front of the NWA officials. Because him unmasking would have caused him to get stripped anyway, because at the time he was under the stipulation that he had to leave the company, Dusty reluctantly gave back the title. This is another one of those things that, through the mind of Dusty Rhodes, it sounds so crazy and it sounds so cliche. A dozen guys had done a similar thing previous and dozens have done it since. In my opinion, I always enjoyed when Dusty would come back as the Midnight Rider. Even though over time it lost its impact the more he did it, I still really enjoyed it. I still thought it was a very fun thing for him to do. Now going from that, our number 2, the Three Faces of Foley. Cactus Jack, Mankind, and Dude Love. I've gone on record several times saying that Mick Foley is my favorite wrestler of all time, and the 3 different iterations, I liked each differently. Out of the 3, Cactus Jack is my absolute favorite. Cactus Jack is a wrestler that made me fall in love with Mick Foley, that made Mick Foley my favorite wrestler. Mankind, in my opinion, was very much the similar character to Cactus Jack. However, he was a little bit more on the deranged, mentally unstable spectrum of the wrestler, where Cactus was just insane and had no regards for himself or anybody else. Mankind seemed to have more of a nihilistic tinge to him, and that's until we started seeing Mick infuse basically himself into the Mankind character, and Mankind morph into basically Mick Foley. Dude Love was, from the mind of Mick Foley, what he would consider a heartthrob in wrestling, basically borrowing heavily from the Boogie Woogie Man Jimmy Valiant, who we already mentioned on this list. But Cactus was the hardcore legend. Cactus Jack was the guy that lost his ear in a match and burned himself in the ring against his idol Terry Funk. If you want examples of how different the different personas are taken, look at how Triple H responded to 2 times that he said he was bringing back Cactus Jack. Both the first time in the WWF, when he does the interviews on the Tron with all 3 characters, and when he takes off his mask as Mankind leading up to the Royal Rumble, I think it's Royal Rumble 2000, saying that Mankind can't take this match, but he does have a replacement. It's Cactus Jack. And just look at the way that Triple H responds to Cactus Jack, selling the fact that if Mick Foley's going to bring out this Cactus Jack persona, he's going to depths that were previously unthought of while he was either Mankind or Dude Love. Much like I've said several times already in this video, and probably hundreds of times over my videos, Mick Foley, absolute legend in the wrestling business, my favorite wrestler of all time. I can't think of anybody else that could pull off 3 gimmicks simultaneously in the same company for the same guy. Now, before we get into our number 1, we do a thing here called the best of the rest. Basically, it's stuff that was thought of for the list but didn't quite make it. First up, Christopher Daniels as Curry Man. If you're a fan of the TNA era of TNA/Impact Wrestling, or even the New Japan Juniors era, or All Japan Juniors era of the 2000s, 2010s, you may have remembered Curry Man. Curry Man was basically a dancing, goofier version of Christopher Daniels. Christopher Daniels was more serious, where Curry Man was more like Disco Inferno with a bowl of curry on his head. I smile and I laugh when I think about this because Christopher Daniels is one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. And much like I said with Mick Foley, here was a guy that a lot of the fans, the smart fans, knew was playing both characters. However, he could pull off the 2 different characters in 2 different roles at the very same time, and the fans bought right into it, were willing to go along with it. I absolutely loved the Curry Man gimmick. It's one that I can't think about without smiling. It was very enjoyable for me. Last but not least, on my best of the rest, a staple of the mid-80s WWE, the Killer Bees. This is probably the most interesting one on this list. The Killer Bees, Jim Brunzell and B. Brian Blair, used a twist on the Twin Magic gimmick where wrestlers that were identical or masked wrestlers would switch in and out behind the referee's back. This was a little bit of the twist. The Killer Bees would come to the ring without the masks on, and during the match they would put on the Killer Bee masks and pull basically what is known as the Twin Magic when the Bellas or the Usos do it, and switch back and forth, which was mostly known as a heel move, but this was done by a face team. Just an interesting take and an interesting switch and twist on a gimmick that's been used hundreds of times by hundreds of teams. I just thought it was interesting. And it's one of those things that fans of that generation of WWF at the time remember fondly. And before I do get into our number 1, if you think I put something too high, something too low, left something off the list altogether, let me know what you think. Hit me up down here in the comments. While you're down there, smash that like button, share the video, subscribe if you haven't. Finally, our number 1 wrestler who was a master of disguise, Chris Jericho. Chris Jericho has evolved and morphed his character through different iterations, different styles, different generations. We're talking about a 30-plus year career at this point, and he's still going and he's still pulling out surprises. Specifically, we're talking about a few times where Chris Jericho used the element of surprise, used his disguise to one-up an opponent. Some of the more famous ones, he dressed up as Doink the Clown to wrestle William Regal in a match on Monday Night Raw at one point. Jericho also showed up at the All In pay-per-view, where no one thought he was going to be able to make it. He had previously said he would never wrestle in America anywhere other than WWE. He shows up in Pentagon Junior's gear, Penta L0M, and attacks Kenny Omega during the All In pay-per-view. We just seen it at the time of this recording. He was sitting ringside for a Ricky Starks match just a week or 2 ago, and he was wearing what looked to be a Kiss Demon type luchador mask. Again, Jericho's the ultimate chameleon in wrestling, whether it be using actual masks to hide who he was, to play tricks on his opponent, or going through the different iterations, whether it be the Painmaker, the List of Jericho, Y2J, the Ayatollah of Rock and Rolla, the Lionheart, one of the absolute legends in the history of wrestling. Like I said, he goes on here because of the differences that he's made, the different times that he's used gimmicks just like this. An absolute legend in the sport, and in my opinion, the master of disguise. Again, if you do think I put something too high, something too low, left off the list, let me know down here. Much like I said, shout out again to Bucky749, the American Samurai. Shout out to Iceman Jeremy. If you want to see something on on any of my videos, whether it be a top 10, it came from the network, an episode you'd like to see on Walking in Memphis. Hit me up in the comments on what you'd like to see. Let me know. Most likely I'm going to try to accommodate. With all that being said, my name is George Coles, and this has been another Heel Heat Top 10.